A family vacation should be filled with laughter, sunshine, and rest, not suspicion, fear, and humiliation. But for the Parker family, what was meant to be a peaceful escape to a luxurious beach resort turned into a nightmare that exposed not only the fragility of their personal peace, but also the enduring sickness of racial bias that poisons so many public and private spaces in America. This is not just a story of mistaken identity or overzealous policing. It is a painful example of what happens when prejudice is so deeply rooted in institutions that it overrides truth, reason, and dignity. And at the center of the story is Ethan Parker, a seasoned FBI agent with years of service protecting the very system that would betray him and his family in broad daylight. Beside him is his wife, Lena, a brilliant civil rights lawyer who has spent her career fighting the very injustices that now threaten to humiliate her husband and scar her children. Their two young kids, Jackson and Emily, innocent, wide-eyed, full of excitement about the ocean, the sand, and the simple joy of being together as a family, had no idea that this vacation would become a lesson in cruelty that no child should ever learn. It began innocently enough. The Parker family checked into their resort, smiled politely at the front desk. Staff admired the grand marble lobby and hurried to their suite, eager to unpack and hit the pool like so many families do. But in America, a black family in a space designed for wealthy, predominantly white guests often faces the unspoken question, do you belong here? And as they settled at the pool, their skin became a silent alarm for suspicion. Security staff approached not with smiles or welcome, but with scrutiny and doubt, asking for their room number, asking for proof, asking again and again, as if their very presence beside the water was a crime. This scene echoes hundreds of real incidents from the story of Bob Marley's granddaughter, racially profiled at an Airbnb, to the viral video of a black man questioned for entering his own apartment building. These moments are not rare. They are the daily background noise of a society that sees black bodies as suspect first and human second. And for Ethan and Lena, the irony was bitter. They had climbed every ladder, played every rule, served every system. Yet here they were explaining themselves like trespassers at their own vacation. And as security pressed harder and the children began to sense the tension, the worst fear of every black parent began to stir. What if this escalates? What if this turns from insult to danger? And it did, because resort security called the police officers arrived, white aggressive, confident that they were about to confront criminals, not guests, and they dismissed Ethan's FBI credentials as fake, refused Lena's protest as irrelevant, and in front of their terrified children, the officers handcuffed Ethan, twisting his arms behind his back, pressing him against a wall as if he were a threat, not a father, not an agent, not a man. And this moment, this public unmaking of dignity, reflects countless real tragedies, like the arrest of Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. on his own porch, or the brutal police handling of innocent black drivers across the country. And as the cuffs clicked shut, Jackson began to cry, asking why they were hurting his daddy. Emily clung to her mother, whispering, "Is he going to jail, Mommy?" And Lena, standing fierce and furious, faced the officers with the full fire of her legal training, demanding names, badge numbers, explanations. But they ignored her, and the crowd began to gather, some guests filming, some gasping, some shaking their heads because the scene was so clearly wrong and yet so horrifyingly familiar. And in the next part, we will witness how this injustice unraveled further, how the truth of Ethan's identity shattered the facade of police righteousness, and how the damage done to dignity and childhood innocence can never be so easily undone, no matter how quickly the mistake is realized. When the truth finally surfaced, it came not with a dramatic confession, but with the quiet, sudden terror of realization on the faces of the officers who had so confidently cuffed a federal agent without cause. Because when Ethan Parker finally managed to make himself heard, despite the tension, despite the raised voices and the frightened faces of his children, he repeated once more, slowly and clearly, "I am a federal agent, FBI, check my credentials." And at last, one officer took the badge, looked closer at the ID, checked the name against the radio, and the color drained from his face as the full weight of the mistake hit him, and the scene changed instantly. The aggression vanished, the confidence crumbled. replaced by stammered apologies and nervous glances, because the system that had felt so certain of its control was now exposed, its assumptions laid bare before the watching eyes of every guest, every recording phone, and worst of all, the innocent eyes of two children whose memory of this vacation would now forever carry the stain of fear and confusion. This kind of humiliation is not rare for Black families traveling in America or abroad, from the wrongful eviction of a Black family from a Portland hotel who had simply asked about a late checkout, to the story of Olympic athlete Dante Hill detained in an airport because TSA agents could not believe his first-class ticket belonged to him. These moments reveal that skin color remains for too many gatekeepers a signal of threat, not success. And as Ethan stood finally released from the cuffs massaging his wrists, the anger and grief in his eyes were clear, and Lena, standing beside him, holding their crying children, demanded not apologies, but names, badge numbers, explanations, because she knew the law, because she fought these cases, because she had warned her husband. Now the ugly proof was wrapped around their own family in the very place meant to offer peace and rest, and the resort manager arrived sweating nervous, apologizing profusely, offering free stays, upgrades, dinners, anything to make this go away. But Lena rejected the offers with quiet fury, because dignity cannot be bought, because her children's innocence could not be restored with cocktails or spa vouchers. And by now the crowd had turned not silent, but muttering angry, some guests asking loudly how this could happen in such a respected place. And the officers, their shame complete, could offer no defense. Only the same empty phrases of misunderstanding and protocol gone wrong. And this kind of public unmasking has been seen before, captured in the viral videos of Black travelers removed from first-class lounges or accused of theft in luxury stores. And each time the same hollow words follow: mistake, confusion, error. But the harm remains, and for the Parkers this harm was now personal and unforgettable. Ethan's mind raced with every case he had investigated, every abuse report he had reviewed, never expecting to become a file in the same system he served and protected. Lena's resolve hardened into steel as she quietly called her law firm partners, preparing a civil rights lawsuit that would shake both the resort and the police department, because this could not end with words. It must end with change. And their children slowly calmed, comforted by whispered promises of safety. But the damage, the crack in their trust, could not be so easily undone. And as the crowd dispersed, as the police retreated, as the sun set over the pool, where joy had turned to fear, the Parker family stood holding each other, knowing that the world would soon hear their story. And in the next part, we will see how the legal fight begins, how public reaction explodes, and how real-life examples of families who fought back against injustice set the stage for a reckoning long overdue. The story of the Parker family did not end at the poolside. It erupted beyond the resort walls into public consciousness as video footage recorded by witnesses spread rapidly across social media, igniting outrage, debate, and demands for accountability. And within hours, hashtags filled the trending lists calling for justice for the Parkers, with comments flooding the resort's website and the police department's official pages denouncing the blatant racism and abuse of power on display. And Lena Parker's law firm released a statement confirming legal action against both the police department and the resort, citing civil rights violations, racial discrimination, and emotional harm inflicted upon their minor children. And the media frenzy began with reporters contacting the family for statements, legal experts debating on television, and public figures, celebrities, and activists sharing the footage condemning the incident. This wave of response echoed similar moments in recent history, such as the case of Rashid Nelson and Dante Robinson, the two Black men arrested at a Philadelphia Starbucks while waiting for a business meeting, or the viral incident of Jermaine Massey, wrongly accused of trespassing while on a phone call in a hotel lobby. Both cases that led to corporate apologies, nationwide discussions on bias training, and expensive settlements. And for Ethan and Lena, these examples served as both warning and encouragement, knowing that visibility could force change, but also wary of how quickly public attention shifts and how easily real justice can slip away in the noise. But Lena was determined this time would be different. This time the system would not be allowed to quietly bury its shame. She prepared not only lawsuits but public appearances, press conferences, calls for reform, demanding that the resort overhaul its security protocols, its staff training, its hiring practices, and that the police department undergo mandatory bias, awareness education, and policy revision. Because this was not about one family, it was about every family who had endured suspicion and humiliation simply for daring to exist in a space not built with them in mind. And as public support grew, so did the consequences. The resort's parent company issued a public apology, vowed an internal review, and placed the security staff on unpaid leave pending investigation, while the police department suspended the involved officers pending disciplinary hearings. But for the Parkers, this was not enough. They wanted systemic change. They wanted a formal consent decree between the city and the Department of Justice to ensure federal oversight on police practices, just as had been done in cities like Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore, Maryland, where years of abuse led to legally binding reforms under court supervision. And as Ethan sat at home watching the news coverage, holding his son close, he reflected on his career, on the irony of being an FBI agent, now needing federal protection from the very system he swore to uphold and protect. Lena, working late into the night with her legal team, drafting motions, assembling witness lists, preparing for depositions, knew that this case would not only define her career, but potentially reshape the policies of both private hospitality and public law enforcement sectors. And their children slowly recovered from the fear of that day, asking fewer questions, sleeping more soundly. But the scar of knowing that the world could so easily turn hostile remained, and Ethan and Lena resolved to teach them strength, pride, and vigilance, to prepare them for a world still marred by ignorance and injustice. And in the next part, we will see how the court battle unfolds, how the public demand for reform is met or resisted, and how real-life cases of successful civil rights litigation can provide both guidance and hope for lasting change in the face of systemic racism. The courtroom was full, silent, heavy with the weight of what the Parker family's case had come to represent. Not just for them, but for every person who had ever been questioned, followed, doubted simply because of the color of their skin. The judge, an older man known for fairness but also caution, looked over the packed gallery. Then at Ethan and Lena sitting side by side, their children at home, shielded from this final chapter of their ordeal, and the lawyers for the resort and the police department shuffled nervously, papers in hand, faces drawn by stress and scrutiny, because this was no longer a simple civil dispute. This was a national symbol of modern racial injustice being tested under law, and the evidence was overwhelming. Video footage, witness statements, security logs, police reports, all painting the same ugly truth that a black family on vacation had been humiliated, profiled, and endangered without cause or provocation. And Lena's closing arguments burned into the minds of the jury as she spoke not of money, but of meaning, asking how a nation could claim equality when innocence itself was treated as threat, when even federal credentials could not protect a black man from public degradation. Ethan, silent, steady at her side, felt pride and sorrow mixed, knowing this was the price of visibility, the burden of being first to fight this battle here. And the verdict came swift and loud. The resort, found liable for racial discrimination, required to overhaul its policies, retrain staff, and pay a multi-million-dollar penalty towards civil rights education and restitution, and the police department ordered to submit to federal oversight under a consent decree, its officers, including those involved in the incident, stripped of duty until they completed mandatory reform programs. And this result was rare, hard-won, echoing the victories of past cases, like the settlement following the Starbucks arrests, or the sweeping reforms forced on cities like Cleveland and Seattle after federal intervention, where years of unchecked abuse demanded structural change. And as the reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, flashing cameras, shouting questions, Ethan and Lena emerged holding hands, tired but unbowed, their lawyer announcing that this was not only a win for the Parkers, but for every family whose joy had been stolen by prejudice. And in the weeks that followed, the impact rippled the resort chain, announcing new hiring practices, diversity audits, guest protections. The city's police chief resigning, replaced by a reform-minded successor, community activists, invited into policy discussions, and public trust cautiously beginning to rebuild. Ethan returned to work, his colleagues silent, some apologetic, some awkward, but all now aware of the wound their system had inflicted on one of their own. And Lena began speaking at legal conferences, civil rights panels, schools telling their story not for sympathy, but as warning and inspiration to young lawyers, future leaders, because change, she knew, must be seeded in truth and watered in persistence, and their children slowly healed too. Jackson drawing pictures again, Emily sleeping through the night, their parents, gentle, firm reminders that dignity was their birthright, no matter what the world sometimes whispered, and this story's end was not perfect. The scars remained, but progress real and undeniable had been carved from pain. And in real life, such outcomes remind us that justice, though slow, can move forward when courage meets exposure. Like the Marriott hotel chain's forced review after a guest's racial profiling complaint, or Delta Airlines settling with passengers removed unfairly. And these lessons matter because they prove that silence feeds injustice, but voice challenges it, and the Parker family chose voice, they chose fight. And in doing so, they lifted not only their own burden, but the hopes of many. And as they stood one final time on the courthouse steps, Ethan holding Jackson, Lena holding Emily, the sun breaking through gray clouds, they smiled quietly, knowing that this vacation, though broken, had become something stronger, a call to conscience for a nation still learning to see. And if you as a viewer take anything from this story, let it be this: justice is not given, it is claimed; respect is not assumed, it is insisted upon; and freedom is not safe unless it is defended every day by every voice willing to speak truth to power. And in that truth, there is hope that tomorrow can be better, because people like the Parkers refuse to accept less. And for that reason, this was more than their story. It was ours.